Now that the holiday season is over, you've probably received your credit card statement. Well, I received mine and it's not looking good. So first off, I knew I wasn't overspending at the Christmas markets, even though I did go to quite a few. Maybe more than a few, a lot of them. And I knew I wasn't overspending on gifts either. I mean, I'm not Santa Claus. The culprits, I realized, were the flights. All the time I spent in seat 20A and seat 15C, and why I now have a huge credit card bill at the beginning of the year. So today we're taking a trip to the major culprits, the airports, as we take a closer look at why flights within Canada are so expensive. Time for some sober reflection while I think of how to pay off the credit card. Now here's a question I get all the time. Why is it cheaper to fly from Toronto to Cancun, for example, than from Toronto to Calgary? Same plane, similar distance, but one ticket costs less than the other. Let me show you just how expensive we're talking. A round-trip flight from Toronto to Calgary, a roughly 4-hour flight, can easily cost $500 or more. And they don't even let you bring a carry-on for free anymore. Similar 4-hour flight round-trip from Toronto to Cancun, almost $100 less. Same airline, by the way. Let's start with the most fundamental challenge. Canada is really big with relatively few people. It's the second largest country in the world with 9.98 million square kilometers, but we only have 40 million people. To put that within scale, that's roughly the population of California living in a country that is larger than the entire United States. Now, compare that to Europe. The entire European Union has 450 million people packed into just 4.2 million square kilometers. In Europe, you can cross multiple countries in the same distance as a Vancouver to Toronto flight, with millions of more people traveling this route. But why does that really matter? Economies of scale. When you're flying from Toronto to Vancouver, that flight needs to be profitable with maybe 150 to 200 people. But in Europe, that same plane can be filled multiple times per day because there are millions more potential travelers. So lower passenger volume per route equals higher cost per seat. Canadian airlines simply can't spread their fixed costs across as many passengers. If you look at it, most Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border, meaning major routes like Vancouver to Toronto are actually long distances, over 3,000 kilometers. So yes, geography matters. But here's the thing, if this was just about geography, we'd expect similar problems in Australia or in the United States. And while those countries have their challenges, their domestic flights are generally cheaper. So what else is going on? The second major factor for the high prices is oligopoly and limited competition, or lack of competition really. Canada's airline is dominated by just two major players, them and them. As of 2023, Air Canada and WestJet together controlled about 74% of the domestic market. That's what economists call a duopoly, and it's terrible for consumers. Compared it to the United States, where you have American Airlines, Delta, United, Southwest, plus ultra-low-cost carriers like Spirit, Frontier, Allegiant, or Europe, where Ryanair, EasyJet, Wizz Air, Eurowings, and countless national carriers are competing aggressively on price. When you only have two major airlines, there's less pressure to compete on price. A 2025 study by the Competition Bureau of Canada found that when just one new competitor flies on the route between two cities, airfares go down by 9% on average. Now you may be thinking, why don't budget airlines like Spirit or Frontier just come to Canada and undercut these prices? Great question. Two reasons. First, cabotage laws. Foreign airlines are legally prohibited from operating routes between Canadian cities. So Southwest can't fly you from Vancouver to Toronto, even if they wanted to. If an American airline wanted to fly from Vancouver to Toronto and pick up passengers before continuing on to Boston, currently they can't. They would need to rely on Air Canada or any other Canadian airline to handle the domestic portion of the journey. Second, foreign ownership restrictions. Foreign investors can't own more than 49% of a Canadian airline. This can be a good thing, but it severely limits international competition and investment in the Canadian market. So why not just have a Canadian budget airline instead, you may ask? We've tried. We've tried to create our own budget airlines, but they just keep failing. Jesco Airlines launched 2002, bankrupt by 2005. Canada 3000, once Canada's second largest carrier, collapsed in 2001. Swoop Airlines reintegrated back into WestJet in 2023 after struggling to remain profitable. Lynx Air ceased operations entirely in February 2024 after just 2 years. Sunwing, now been integrated into WestJet's operations. Why do they keep failing? Multiple reasons. First, airport slot access. Toronto Pearson and Vancouver International are operating at near capacity during peak time, so new entrants can't get the landing slots they need when travelers actually want to fly. Second, gate access and terminal space. Major airports have limited gate capacity, and incumbent airlines have long-term agreements that lock up the best gates. Third, the operating costs in Canada are actually very high. All the fees that we would get to very soon. This ultra-low-cost carrier simply can't make the math work. So right now, only Flair Airlines and Porter Airlines are managing to compete against the giants, but they serve a limited number of routes. Porter now offers free snacks and Wi-Fi on routes that other airlines charge for. This competition could eventually drive down prices, but they're still the exception, not the rule. So the bottom line is, Canada's airline functions more like an oligopoly than a competitive market. So as it is in an oligopoly, consumers pay more. Now, let's talk about something that really drives up your ticket price. The massive pile of taxes and fees tagged onto every flight. I see the high income taxes were not enough. Let me break down an actual ticket I priced recently, Vancouver to Toronto round trip. Base fare $325, but then comes the add-ons. Every time you fly out of a Canadian airport, you pay an airport improvement fee. Round trip total $71.45. Now, compare that to the United States, where these fees are capped at just $4.50. Canadian airports charge 7 times more than American airports. In May 2024, the federal government increased the air traveler security charge by 33%. So my round trip for this flight was $18.92. In the United States, the equivalent 9/11 security fee is capped at about $5.60 per one-way trip, or roughly $11.20 round trip. Then there's the NAV Canada surcharge that covers air navigation services. Canada privatized this in 1996, and now passengers pay directly for it. For this flight, it was $70. And then there's goods and services tax, $20.70. The total fees and taxes for this round-trip flight was $181.07, bringing my final ticket price to $506.07. So nearly 36% of my ticket price is fees and taxes. And that's before any baggage fees or seat selection charges. Now, let's compare to a similar US domestic flight. Round trip Seattle to Boston, roughly the same distance. Base fare $191.78. Transportation tax $14.38. Civil aviation security service fee $11.20. Passenger facility charge $9. Flight segment tax domestic $10.60. Total fees and taxes $45.18. Bringing a final ticket price to $236.96. in USD. The Canadian equivalent is $324.73. The difference is stark. And they still get to bring a carry-on for free in the US. According to 2022 reports by Intervistas Consulting, Canadian passengers pay approximately $50 to $100 more in taxes and fees per round-trip ticket compared to US passengers on similar routes. But wait, there's more. Here's something most Canadians don't know. While Canadian airports are operated by private non-profit organizations, the land they sit on is owned by the federal government, and airports have to pay rent. In 2024, Canadian airports paid a record $495 million in rent to Ottawa. That's up 68% from just 10 years ago. And guess who ultimately pays for that rent? You do, through those airport improvement fees. So on average, between 25% to 33% of the airport improvement fee you pay goes directly to covering the airport's rent payments to the federal government. At this rate, we may all just decide to start living at the airport if we also pay rent there. Maybe I'll petition Toronto developers to build me a condo in Terminal 1. By the way, I only just found that there is a gym in Terminal 1. That is interesting. Now, even for the airlines that do operate here, the costs are astronomical. Toronto Pearson charges Air Canada $1,500 just to land a Boeing 737 MAX. Then they charge $7.49 for every domestic passenger and $2.91 for every minute the plane sits at the gates. According to a 2023 analysis by IACA, Toronto Pearson has landing fees and terminal charges that rank among the top 10 most expensive airports globally. Its operating costs are among the highest in the world. And guess what? They all get passed on to you. This is fun. Now let's talk fuel taxes. Airlines in Canada pay federal excise tax of 10 cents per litre on aviation fuel. In the US, just 6.9 cents per litre. But here's the real difference. The United States doesn't apply sales taxes to aviation fuel at all. Canada does. And let's not forget, Canadian airlines are also subject to the federal carbon tax on fuel, adding yet another cost that gets passed on to, guess who? The passengers. When you add it all up, Canadian airlines pay significantly more to fuel their planes than their American counterparts, and those costs inevitably show up in your ticket price. Now, why are the fees themselves so high, you may ask? Part of it is the funding model. Canadian airports were privatized in the 1990s and operate as not-for-profit entities that must fund their own infrastructure. US airports, by contrast, often receive federal funding and municipal support. Canada operates on what's called a user-pay model for air travel. So the philosophy is, if you fly, you should pay for the infrastructure, security, and services. Taxpayers who don't fly shouldn't subsidize those who do. In contrast, the United States treats airports and air travel as critical transportation infrastructure, like roads and bridges. So it uses taxpayers' dollars to help fund them. So let's recap. You're paying to use the airports, paying for security, indirectly paying the government's rent, paying extra fuel taxes, all before the plane even takes off. Now, flying in Canada isn't cheap for the airlines either. Okay, hear me out. Harsh weather, long routes, and smaller regional airports drive up maintenance, fuel, and staffing costs. Operating in the north or across provinces requires more infrastructure. Think the icing equipment, cold weather maintenance, specialized training, and that cost, again, trickles down to passengers. Toronto Pearson and Vancouver International are operating at near capacity during peak travel time. According to the Greater Toronto Airport Authority, Pearson handled 45 million passengers in 2023, approaching its practical capacity of around 50 to 55 million without significant infrastructure expansion. So limited capacity means fewer flights available, which means less supply, which means higher prices. Also, incumbent airlines will lock up valuable spots, making it nearly impossible for new competitors to enter. And then, airports can charge premium prices because they know airlines simply have no alternative. Compare this to the United States, which has multiple competing airport hubs in many regions. Can't get a good price from New York JFK? Try Newark or try LaGuardia. Los Angeles too expensive? Try Burbank, try Long Beach or try Ontario. In Canada, if you're in Toronto, you're flying from Pearson. Maybe Billy Bishop Airport, depending on availability. Vancouver, YVR is your only real option for most destinations. This infrastructure bottleneck reinforces the lack of competition, which keeps prices high. There's also the problem of limited alternatives to air travel. In countries like France or Japan, high-speed trains compete directly with airlines. In Canada, not so much. Outside of the Toronto-Montreal-Ottawa corridor, train routes are long, slow, and expensive, and driving can take days. That means airlines face little to no competition from ground transportation. And when there's no real alternative, prices will stay high. Now, if you think Toronto to Vancouver is expensive, let's talk about what it costs to fly to Canada's northern and remote communities. A round-trip flight from Toronto to equally Nunavut, about 2,100 kilometers, can easily cost $2,000 to $3,000. That's roughly $1 per kilometer, compared to about 15 cents per kilometer for Toronto to Vancouver. And the reason for this dramatic difference boils down to even lower passenger volume, harsh operating conditions, limited infrastructure, no competition, high fuel costs. For many northern communities, air travel isn't a luxury. It's the only way in or out, because there are no roads connecting most of Nunavut to the rest of Canada. In the United States, the Essential Air Service Program subsidizes flights to rural communities to ensure connectivity. And that program had a grant of approximately $600 million in 2025, supporting air service to 170 rural communities. Canada has no equivalent program at the federal level. Now, while there may be some regional subsidies, they are very much limited in scope. According to a 2021 report by the Canadian Northern Economic Development Agency, the lack of affordable air connectivity is one of the top barriers to economic development in northern Canada. Even in southern Canada, regional routes face economic challenges. Consider a flight from Calgary to Cranbrook, British Columbia, or from Toronto to Thunder Bay, Ontario. These routes often cost nearly as much as major routes, despite being much shorter distances. Many regional routes can't support direct flights with enough frequency to be economical, so airlines would create multi-stop routes. So a flight from Calgary to Cranbrook may stop over in Vancouver. And each stop means additional landing fees, more crew time and cost, longer total travel time, and less efficient aircraft utilization. So while they often operate this route to maintain essential connectivity and fulfill public service expectations, the economics are challenging. And the results? Regional travelers often face the worst of both worlds: high prices and inconvenient routings with connections. Now, while there are policy changes that could potentially improve this situation, we'll leave that up to the IR Ops at Ottawa to discuss. But what can you do instead to reduce your domestic flight costs? Let me share 7 practical strategies. First is the border up. If you live near the US border, consider driving across and flying from a US airport. For example, instead of flying Vancouver to Toronto for maybe $650, drive to Seattle and fly Seattle to Toronto. That would cost like 540 Canadian dollars. So you save about $110, plus you avoid the higher Canadian fees. Some popular border airport options include Buffalo, New York for Toronto area residents, Bellingham or Seattle, Washington for Vancouver area residents, Plattsburgh, New York for Montreal area residents. But more importantly, be sure to factor in gas, parking, exchange rates, and your time, of course. But if you're a large family or a large group, the savings can be substantial. Number 2, strategic use of points and miles. Using your points and miles can be a very great alternative to pay for your travels. Aeroplan, WestJet rewards, and even BMO Porter offer outsized value on domestic flight redemptions. Number 3, consider positioning your flights through the US. Sometimes it's cheaper to fly Toronto to a US city, then to Vancouver, than to fly directly. So you had a connection, but you also save some money. You can use Google Flights Explore feature to find these routing deals. Number 4, book way ahead. Booking very early, ideally like 3 to 6 months in advance of your travel dates, may be a very good way to save some costs. Number 5, be flexible with your dates. If you fly between Tuesday to Saturday instead of Friday to Sunday, you can easily save about 30 to 50%. So use Google's Flights Calendar View to see the different price differences across dates. Sometimes shifting by just one day may save you $100 or more. Number 6, consider alternative airports. Secondary airports usually have lower fees and less congestion. So you can fly from Almaty instead of Toronto Pearson for some routes, or Abbotsford instead of Vancouver for certain destinations. Number 7, track aerofares and flash sales. Canadian Airlines will occasionally publish aerofares or aggressive sales, so significantly lower fares does happen, just very rarely and briefly. Now, while these strategies can save you 15% to 40% on many trips, they won't make Canadian domestic flights as cheap as US or European travel. All of the structural factors we discussed, geography, oligopoly, the fees, they're still there. But understanding the system means you can work within it more effectively. So, to sum it up, Canada's expensive flights come down to 4 major factors working together: geography and market size, lack of competition, high fees and taxes, and infrastructure constraints. Could this change? Yes. But it would require coordinated policy action across multiple levels of government and regulatory agencies. Much of this is within the government's control. Next time you book a flight and wonder why it's pricey, you know exactly what's behind that price tag. So what do you think? Should the government reduce its fees and taxes, or is the user pay model the right approach? And what's the most you've ever paid for a domestic flight in Canada? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. I post Canada-related travel content, travel guides, hotel reviews, and cost breakdowns. And now I'm also looking at the economics behind travel and tourism in Canada. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.